Out of that pretty vast selection of gadgets available to equip throughout the Battlefield franchise, there's a bunch of really good ones that are going to be useful for supporting your role in the game. And there's also going to be a pile of not so good ones that tend to get left on the shelf. These might seem a bit pointless, ineffective, or extremely situational, or they might just seem a bit stupid, not really fitting into a specific class very well, and not really feeling like a viable option to equip, because you're going to be sacrificing other, more practical gadgets if you do. You've only got 2 gadget slots, so you've got to choose wisely. And although pretty much every gadget in the Battlefield games have some form of function, essentially making none of them completely useless, there's definitely a few outliers in the pack that are usually best left on the menu screen. These are the gadgets we're going to be focusing on today, the ones that I consider to be less useful, overly circumstantial, or generally wasted picks, compared to the other options you've got on offer. So without further ado, here's my top 10 worst gadgets in the Battlefield games. To start us off, we've got Battlefield 5's RMN50 rifle frag launcher, a fairly awkward bit of kit that often seems like a bit of a pointless thing to use. This thing isn't like your typical rifle grenade launcher, because it's got a lot more in common with the mortar, popping out explosive shells in a bit of an arc that actually detonate after a set amount of time. I guess you could call it a trickier to use version of the rifle frag, but in a sense, because of its ease of use, it can often seem like a less dependable gadget overall. Those projectiles that the RMN50 launches have to be carefully aimed due to the way they lob through the air and affected by gravity. But of course, because they also work on a fused timer, you also need to account for that too, setting the timer for your frag to go off using a bit of an awkward white bar which appears when you hold down the trigger before launching. Hold it down for too long and the bomb's going to blow up mid-air, often before it gets to your target. Don't hold it down for long enough and it'll just bounce off the floor and act like a grenade, not detonated on impact. To make matters worse, those projectiles don't really seem to deal very much damage to vehicles either. And with most infantry players dashing around sliding all over the place like a bunch of whizzed up kids on a sugar rush, this makes those carefully placed timed explosives all the harder to land bang on target. The final nail in the coffin, the RMN50 is exclusive to the Recon class, which seems like a bit of a daft place for it to be, especially considering there's so many other, much more useful gadgets that are going to suit Recon players a hell of a lot more. Next up on the list is Battlefield Hardline's FR mask. Basically a fire resistant mask that somehow helps to protect your whole body from getting burnt by fire. Try and work that one out. Now this is a lot less useful than it actually sounds. The FR mask doesn't completely snuff out the burning effects of fire, because if a guy lobs a Molotov cocktail in your direction, you're still likely to get singed and take some damage when it explodes. The mask does stop you from igniting when you walk through those little fire puddles though. So if you want to do everything you can to reduce the chances of getting barbecued, then at least it'll help you out there. But let's face it, fire isn't exactly a super common thing to be killed by in Hardline, because if someone does happen to chuck one of those incendiary grenades down, you can always counter it by just simply avoiding it, stepping out of the way and trying your best not to walk into the flames on the floor. Pretty straightforward. At the end of the day, you don't really need the FR mask, unless you're prone to running into your own Molotovs, or unless you don't have the patience for enemy flames to die down. The mask itself is also going to cause the edges of your screen to be a bit dark, which I guess could be a bit annoying for some players. Plus it's also going to take up your operator gadget slot, that could have been used for a health pack or revive syringe. So all in all, is that extra fire resistance really worth it? To most players, probably not. Making its way into 8th place is the M320 3GL, a pretty clumsy noob tube from Battlefield 4 that often struggles to take down its targets reliably. It doesn't matter if you're accurate with the 3GL, this grenade launcher still isn't going to feel very consistent anyway. Unlike the normal high explosive variant that shoots out a single projectile, the 3GL pops off 3 of those grenades instead, only 3 much weaker grenades that inflict less damage per explosion. Despite essentially throwing 3 bombs at a time, the splash damage is almost half of the standard version, and those explosives are only going to dish out a maximum of 45 damage each, so all 3 bombs are going to be needed to take a target down. Not too bad if they're already weakened, but a lot trickier to pull off if they're not, often requiring more luck than actual precision. This gives the 3GL a much more spammy nature, only really useful in tight spaces and against enemies that are all bundled up together, that have got themselves cornered. Not entirely useless, but a hell of a lot more situational than other grenade launchers, with those puny blasts often not doing enough to get the job done, especially against players that are out in the open. Not to mention that you only have access to 6 grenades upon spawning, which is basically 2 launches, and the grenades can't knock down walls or destroy buildings, giving them barely any destructive power at all too. If you plan on spending your day sitting next to a buddy's ammo crate at one of Operation Locker's chaotic choke points, then this gadget might be able to net you a few cheap kills, but in a competitive sense, you're often much better off just going for the standard HE variants. Coming in at number 7 is the SOFLAM from Battlefields 3 and 4. Not a completely worthless gadget if you're working together with a buddy to take on vehicles, but otherwise something that's not really worth choosing. The idea behind the SOFLAM is a decent one. It's a stationary gadget that doesn't really require much skill on your behalf, just place it down in the right place, and the gadget's going to do what it does best. Laser designating enemy vehicles so they can be taken down easier by your mates, with those lock-on launchers. It functions in a pretty similar way to the PLD, and it can definitely be effective in certain situations, with teammates that happen to have a launcher equipped. The big problem is, with the SOFLAM being a gadget fixed to a selected spot, it's often going to be a very easy thing for an enemy vehicle to take out. This isn't made any better by the fact that the gadget might as well just be sat there with a massive arrow above its head, practically asking to be destroyed, because when it does laser paint those targets, it also emits a pretty strong glare effect that's visible by those enemies quite clearly. This is the same with the PLD, but at least with that gadget you can move out of the way and retreat behind cover if the enemy vehicle sees you. The SOFLAM doesn't have any legs, and therefore can't scurry off to safety to protect itself, so most of the time it just winds up getting blown to pieces before it has a chance to do anything productive. It's not a terrible gadget, but unless you're coordinating with a good squad and are specifically set up with the mission to take on vehicles, the SOFLAM can often seem like a bit of a wasted pick, especially with it getting destroyed so easily. Yep, the head on the stick comes in at 6th place. The sniper decoy might sound like an interesting concept to deceive opposing recon players, but not only have most snipers gotten wise to them, but the decoys also don't really do enough to seem worth using on a regular basis, especially considering the recon class typically has some of the most useful gadgets in the series, many of which are generally worth choosing instead. These weird looking things have appeared in both Battlefields 1 and 5. In Battlefield 1 it was literally just a creepy looking head on a bike, looking like some sort of crappy Halloween decoration, and in Battlefield 5 it looked a little bit more like a wooden mannequin, which, considering player models looked a little bit like mannequins anyway in that game, kinda went in the decoy's favour a bit. This gadget had the very same sole purpose in both games though, and that was to try and trick other snipers to shoot them, not only acting as a bit of a distraction, but also acting as a reconnaissance tool, with the tricked enemy pinging up on the minimap and becoming highlighted for everyone to see. I suppose the decoys are a bit more useful on Battlefield 5, due to 3D spotting basically not really existing in that game, but nevertheless they weren't exactly fantastic gadgets worth picking over something like the spotting flares or radio beacons, because they often got destroyed super quickly, and they only spotted a single enemy when they did. A pretty bizarre gadget to use, that's not really worth all the hassle of setting up in the first place, let alone equipping on a loadout. Right in the middle of the list now at number 5 is the ballistic shield from Battlefield 4. Something that not only feels a bit pointless in most situations, but is also very restricted in how you can actually use it effectively. The fact is, this gadget was a hell of a lot more useful in Battlefield Hardline, because it was stored on your back when equipped, and sort of acted like a bulletproof shield for your back, which was probably a more useful quality than actually pulling it out and using it as intended. In Battlefield 4, the shield just disappeared when it wasn't being used, taking away that special back protecting quality it had in Hardline. You can't use any weapons when you're holding it, and it's only going to protect you from enemies that are directly in front of you. You can't go prone, sprinting will cause the shield to be held to the side, and the glass that you're looking through can still be broken, meaning that even from the front, you're still not totally safe from attacking enemies. The ballistic shield is pretty flawed in Battlefield 4, and in a lot of situations, by the time you deploy it to try and block out some incoming fire, it's already too late and you're lying dead on the ground, meaning you would have been much better just returning the fire and taking your enemy head on instead in a gunfight. It can be somewhat useful pushing forwards along narrow routes with a few teammates backing you up, but you're still going to be extremely vulnerable to explosives and grenades, plus your enemies will just likely shoot your feet and viewport, or try to get around you and gun you down from side flanks when outnumbered. So despite it being there to protect you, you can still expect to die quite a lot, even when it's being used. Another pretty rubbish shield can be seen in Battlefield 1, in the form of the Scout Class's Sniper Shield. This thing is arguably even worse though, because you can't actually use it while moving around, being forced to plop it down in a fixed position and basically camp behind it, with the shield functioning as a bit of a wall. You can go prone behind the shield and take a look at the battlefield through a small gap near its base, which is essentially the glory hole of death. Not only can you poke your rifle through said gap and shoot down at the snipers and players in front of you, but they can also shoot back through it too, giving them a nice stationary target to aim at that can't move out of the way. By using the shield, you're practically giving enemy snipers a really easy opportunity to take you down with a simple headshot, because you're going to be lying flat on the ground, incapable of strafing around to avoid incoming shots, drastically reducing your maneuverability, therefore making you a sitting duck. This gadget is designed for noobs. Noobs that just want to camp on hilltops all day and snipe. But the funny thing is, they're not actually doing themselves any favours by using this shield, because it'll often do more harm than good, acting as a pretty crap cover piece, trying to protect the super predictable players sat behind it. Because all the enemy has to do is look out for that glare, aim at the gap in the shield, and then boom. Another nice easy kill for them. Coming up in our third place spot is Battlefield Hardline's Night Vision Goggles. A gadget designed to make life a little bit easier for users in low lit environments, but often just ends up doing the complete opposite instead. Equipping this gadget lets your character wear some pretty snazzy looking night vision goggles, making you look like a cop version of Sam Fisher. The goggles might seem cool and all to wear on your character model, but that's basically one of the only reasons why you'd probably want to use them. Just like with the other goggle gadgets in Hardline, the night vision limits your field of view, sort of blackening out the edges of your screen, and everything else basically has a bright green filter applied over it, which might help out a tiny bit on some of the dark maps, but still don't exactly improve visibility all that much. As, although it might be a bit annoying, you're often better off just increasing the game's brightness in the menus, which will probably help you out even more, without taking up a gadget slot in the process. The infrared scopes that you can equip on your weapons generally do a much better job doing the same thing, because they actually illuminate enemy players and make them stand out amongst the environment, unlike the goggles. Thankfully you can toggle the gadget on and off, but it takes quite a while to do so, having to run through a bit of a slow animation first. You're also restricted to using low magnification scopes only, so once again, this is another limitation that makes the goggles even more awkward to use. And considering all they're really doing is just brightening up your screen a bit and making everything glow green, for most players they're not going to be effective enough to seem worth picking over other gadgets, especially when you could just use the IRMV scopes instead. So in second place, we've got Battlefield 1's repair tool, which is a pretty good way to waste a perfectly good gadget slot. Now I know what you're thinking, the repair tool is one of the Battlefield franchise's staple gadgets that's provided tons of help for vehicle players over the many years it's been around. In past games, the repair tool fixed up tanks, helped to batch up choppers while still flying around in the air, and was generally a pretty useful bit of kit to have equipped on the loadout, especially for vehicle players, or for teammates that like to tag along with said vehicle players. Other than the fact that the repair tool came back in the form of an old hammer wrench thingamajig rather than a blowtorch, the whole function of the gadget remained the same in Battlefield 1, being there for the sole purpose of fixing up damaged vehicles and gun emplacements, while occasionally being used to bash an enemy player's head in, just for a bit of fun. But Battlefield 1 introduced a few new mechanics, and one of these mechanics in particular pretty much rendered the repair tool obsolete for most players. The fact that vehicle players could now fix up their own tanks, planes and cars without having to leave their vehicles, and without having to rely on some generous teammates to do the fixing for them either. If you want to provide a bit of assistance and help a tank player out, you can still do so with the repair tool just like before. But now there's no real reason to equip it over the support class's wide array of other, much more appealing gadgets, because vehicle players don't really need to rely on you anymore, having the ability to patch up their vehicles themselves, kinda making it a bit of a pointless thing for a support player to equip. And last of all, in our number one spot of worst Battlefield gadgets, is the MP-APS from Battlefield 4. A gadget that could have had a lot of potential, but is so ineffective and so situational that it hardly ever gets a chance to do anything productive at all. This thing was so rubbish that a lot of you guys will have probably forgotten it even existed in the first place. Its purpose in the game is to destroy tank shells, rockets and certain explosives from flying towards you, stopping them dead in their path, which actually sounds like a fantastic thing to be able to do. In reality though, it's far less useful than it sounds, to the point where it's barely even usable at all. When you stick it down on a surface, you'll see a bunch of funky rave lights appear, to to indicate the gadget's actively protecting you from the direction it's facing. If a stray rocket does so happen to fly in your direction, then the MP-APS should be able to block it, but then you'll have to wait around for about 10 seconds before it'll be active again. In this time, you're vulnerable to everything it was designed to protect you from, but the thing is, yourself and the gadget are still not safe from throwable grenades, and you're definitely not safe from bullets, making the MP-APS's active protection all the more situational. It might be able to stop the odd rocket or two every now and then if you just sat camping behind the gadget, but more often than not, it's not going to have any kind of practical use at all, especially if you're moving around the maps, capturing objectives, and generally just playing the game in a natural way. Actually being in a situation to use this gadget effectively is often extremely rare, and even if you do manage to stop something, you're not even going to get any points for doing so. The concept isn't terrible, but the MP-APS is just a tragically underpowered gadget that could have been a whole lot better, especially if it stopped grenades, and didn't leave you so bloody vulnerable in between its protection cycles. So those are my top 10 worst Battlefield gadgets, but let me know down in the comments which ones you think are the worst, and if there's any others you think should be added to the list as well. Thanks for watching guys, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and want to see more, and I'll be seeing you in that next episode.